This is the Old West, Element 3, Part 2, continuing our discussion about how white settlement affected Native American cultural history. And where we start here is with the Iroquois of the modern Northeast, led by a chief named Hiawatha, who created the closest thing to a Native American empire in the late 1500s in this part of the world with the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, as you can see here, the Iroquois Confederacy is made up of 5 major tribes: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. These tribes celebrated together and united against outsiders, but often kept their own quote-unquote separate fires. So they were unified when it came to dealing with other people, and they were unified in fellowship, but they would maintain a lot of their own customs and a lot of their own culture. They weren't all just one. They were a confederacy, a union of various very independent tribes. Now, they conflicted first with neighboring Hurons and Eries, then with the French, English, and Dutch later on, often shrewdly playing them against each other. The staple of Iroquois culture was the longhouse, often about 25 feet wide by about 200 feet long, with 3 to 5 fireplaces inside. All families in a longhouse were related through the maternal line, through the mother, and therefore the matriarch, the mother, was typically in charge. Now, the Iroquois were greatly supported by the British, so eventually the British defeat in the American Revolution marked the end of the Iroquois Confederacy and the Iroquois people. They scattered or were put on reservations in various spots. This man right here, Handsome Lake, in 1799, said that a vision had shown him the end of his people if they didn't mend their ways, forsake alcohol, etc., etc. His teachings live on among Native American cultures to this day. The first major conflicts between settlers and Native Americans in North America took place with the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, initiated by Lord De La Warr at Jamestown after John Smith had left. There were 3 major Powhatan Wars, all of which were won by the settlers. 1614, the settlers win, and that's the war around that time where Pocahontas marries John Rolfe, not John Smith, but John Rolfe, the tobacco planter. Another one happened in 1622, again the settlers win, but 347 settlers were killed in that war, including John Rolfe, who was very important to the economy at that time, as you'll find out when we study economics later on in the second unit. And then the third war in 1644, the settlers win, and this is key because it's after 1644 that the first reservation in the United States is set up after that last Anglo-Powhatan War. Disease would eventually finish off the Powhatan tribes by 1685. But disruptions to the Native American way of life in the 1600s were just beginning with the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. Native Americans had a long history before Columbus's arrival, and that was all about to change. Horses, some being mustangs, also known as the wild horses of the West who had strayed from Spanish herds in Latin America, increased their migration to the West, most notably to the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes. Disease was by far the biggest issue. It wiped out cultures and forced scattered remnants of old tribes together to form new tribes. And trade also changed dramatically. Native Americans now sought rifles to dominate prime hunting grounds and to get the skins and pelts that Europeans wanted, which led to increased tribal wars, or wars among tribes that were already there, not with the settlers. But eventually, a middle ground developed in a sense. The eastern seaboard felt the brunt of European expansion first. Tribes farther inland had the advantage of space and time and numbers until large numbers of Europeans came with diseases and things along those lines. The Algonquin tribe of the Great Lakes, for example, became powerful by absorbing various surrounding tribes and dealing from a position of strength with the Europeans. If you wanted to do business with inland tribes, you had to conform to Algonquin ways, even if it meant you taking on an Algonquin wife. Also, shortly before the Pilgrims' arrival in 1620, 75% of the local Wampanoag died from disease, Weakened, they tried to make friends with the Pilgrims through Squanto and Massasoit. Those two basically had saved the Pilgrims. However, more English settlers came and more conflicts started, leading to the Pequot War of 1637 and essentially wiping out the Pequot tribe. Massasoit's son, Metacom, who was also called King Philip by the English, began uniting tribes in 1675 to go against the settlers. This was called King Philip's War, and when King Philip's War ended a year later in 1676, 52 Puritan settlements had been attacked, 12 of which had been destroyed, but the Indians were defeated. Metacom himself was drawn and quartered and beheaded, with his head mounted on a pike in the Plymouth colony for years for people to see. His wife and his son were sold into slavery. There were also some problems between settlers and Native Americans in the Carolina colony. Shortly after settlement, Carolina had started enslaving Native Americans. Savannah Indians, who had aided the settlers in capturing native slaves, decided to leave for Pennsylvania in 1707. The settlers responded by slaughtering as many of the Savannahs as they could by 1710. The Tuscarora War of 1711 leads to hundreds being sold into slavery. Survivors migrated north to become the sixth fire, so to speak, or the sixth tribe of the Iroquois Confederacy. The Yamasee Indians were driven out of Carolina in 1715. So whether it be reservations or whether it be battles or whatever the case may be, Native Americans are actively being moved out of areas as early as the 1600s. And in 1763, there was Pontiac's Rebellion. The Ottawa chief Pontiac led this rebellion, hoping to drive the British out of the Ohio country, and they were aided by French fur traders in the process. Pontiac's Rebellion, again in 1763, killed 2,000 British soldiers and civilians. But the British responded with biological warfare, ordering blankets infected with smallpox to be distributed among the Indians. Pontiac's Rebellion ended when he died at the hands of a chief rival in 1769. In 1784, another advancement for white settlers took place with the Treaty of Fort Stanwix between the United States government and the Iroquois. It was the first time Native Americans signed a treaty that actively gave up some of their land. Even during the American Revolution, pioneers had migrated west. The Miami Confederacy was also rebelling against white settlement. The Miami let the United States know that the Ohio River was not to be crossed into modern-day Ohio and Indiana. The Ohio River is the border between modern-day West Virginia and modern-day Virginia and the Ohio and Indiana areas. Also, Kentucky is on that border as well. They defeated U.S. forces there in 1790 and 1791. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, General Mad Anthony Wayne beats the Miami, leading to the Treaty of Greenville, and Miami at that point gave up all claims they had to the Old Northwest. The Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 proved to be another setback for Native American tribes. Shawnee tribe brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, called the Prophet by whites, formed a confederacy of all tribes east of the Mississippi to rebel against white settlement. It inspired a lot of unity and cultural revival in Native American tribes. But this guy, William Henry Harrison, who was the governor of the Indiana Territory at the time, took an army to the junction of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers in Indiana. Tecumseh was absent from the battle site. In fact, he had known that Harrison was approaching, but thought it was a bad idea to fight Harrison. Tenskwatawa, however, attacked Harrison's army. Harrison won soundly, and the Battle of Tippecanoe made him a national hero, eventually leading to him being President of the United States. As the 1800s continued on, we saw continual efforts to remove Native Americans from the East. Approximately 125,000 Native Americans east of the Mississippi River in 1820 existed, often respected by the Anglos, by the whites, for assimilating into white culture. What that meant was that they tried to accept and practice the aspects of white culture, and that gave them respect among the whites themselves. Among these groups who had assimilated the best were the 5 civilized tribes in the southeast, as they were called. They were the leading assimilating tribes of the time. The five civilized tribes were the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, made the greatest effort to assimilate. The Cherokee Nation accepted private property, which was a distinctly non-Native American concept. Native Americans, remember, didn't like political map lines, but the Cherokee accepted the idea of private property. They sent their kids to Anglo schools or English schools, and they had a written constitution. Some prosperous cotton planters even had African slaves among the Cherokee tribes. And yet, none of that was really good enough. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed. It started in 1828 when Georgia took over Cherokee land claims and affairs. The U.S. Supreme Court supported the Cherokee appeals 3 different times. They essentially said Georgia can't do what Georgia's trying to do. The problem is that it was up to the chief executive, President Andrew Jackson, to enforce the laws that were judged on by the Supreme Court, and he refused to do so. He refused to even recognize the Supreme Court decisions, much less enforce them. His most famous quote during this time was, "John Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it." John Marshall being the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. 100,000 Native Americans were forcibly relocated west of the Mississippi River to modern-day Oklahoma, which would later be given away in the Oklahoma land races. For the Cherokee, this became known as the Trail of Tears that continued throughout the 1830s. Often suffering from diseased blankets and lack of food and lack of proper water, they were forcibly removed from their homelands to Oklahoma, the most prominent of the 5 civilized tribes, because they had done so much to try to assimilate to white culture, and that was still not good enough. In order to help deal with these tribes and their location and their movements to the new Great Reservation of the West, as it were, west of the Mississippi River, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was established in 1836. But that didn't mean that in the 1830s there still weren't problems between Native American tribes and settlers. The Black Hawk War of 1832 involved the Sauk and Fox tribes. They resisted, but they eventually lost. And there was also the Seminole War of 1835 to 1842. These were guerrilla tactic wars being fought in the Everglades. As you can see here, the U.S. military is scouting around for the Seminole Native Americans who are hiding amongst the snakes and the alligators and everything else, looking to snipe whenever they can. It was, after all, a guerrilla tactics war. But despite all this history, Native Americans were actually willing to help out the whites in the Civil War that whites had between them. Some fighting for the North, and some fighting for the South. The 5 civilized tribes, now located in quote-unquote Indian territory, which was modern-day Oklahoma, sided with the Confederacy, primarily because some had owned slaves and the U.S. government had forced them out of their territory, so they felt like it was right to fight against the U.S. government. Meanwhile, a rival faction of Cherokees and Plains Indians fought for the Union, usually as scouts and things like that. It didn't do them much good after the war. Most of them, if not all of them, would be sent to reservations by 1890. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.